Mary Chen adjusts her threadbare cardigan, her weathered hands smoothing wrinkles that have set in like the lines on her face. The morning light filtering through her apartment window catches the dust motes dancing around her small living room, a space that feels emptier with each passing year. At 87, she's learned to move carefully, deliberately, each motion a quiet rebellion against time and loneliness. The photos on her mantelpiece tell a story that ended 5 years ago. 3 children, Michael, the eldest, now a surgeon in Boston, Sarah, the middle child, a tech executive in Seattle, and David, the youngest, a real estate developer in Chicago. All successful, all absent. "Good morning, my darlings," she whispers to their frozen smiles, a ritual she maintains even though the last time any of them called was 18 months ago. The frames are meticulously dusted, positioned just so, as if keeping their images pristine might somehow draw them back. Mary shuffles to her small kitchen, where a single cup and plate await their daily duty. The routine is precise. 1 slice of whole wheat toast, a soft-boiled egg, though her arthritis makes peeling it an exercise in patience, and a cup of green tea. The same breakfast she used to make for her late husband, James, before cancer took him 8 years ago, before everything changed. The morning news drones in the background, her constant companion now. A story about elder care catches her attention, and she turns up the volume with her shaking remote. Growing crisis of elder abandonment in America, with more seniors finding themselves alone and without family support. Mary's laugh is bitter, barely audible. "Tell me something I don't know," she says to the empty room. Her Social Security check barely covers the rent for this 1-bedroom apartment in Minneapolis's aging Riverside Plaza. The irony isn't lost on her. She and James had owned a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Edina, the house where they'd raised their children. The house that had been sold, against her wishes, after James died. "It's for the best, Mom," Michael had said, his voice carrying that particular tone doctors use with difficult patients. "The house is too big for you to maintain. We can put the money in a trust." Sarah had nodded, already typing on her phone. "We'll find you somewhere manageable. Somewhere safe." David hadn't said anything at all, just stood there with his hands in the pockets of his tailored suit, examining the crown molding as if calculating its value. The truth they'd never spoken aloud, was that the house had been paid off, and property taxes weren't an issue with her pension and James's life insurance. But the land had become valuable, and developers were circling. David had known this, of course. He'd been the one to broker the sale, though he'd recused himself officially due to conflict of interest. Mary places her empty teacup in the sink, her reflection distorted in its ceramic curve. The woman looking back at her seems impossibly old, though she feels in her mind like the same person who once danced in that living room with 3 small children clinging to her legs. The phone sits silent on its cradle. She'd given up her cell phone plan last year, another unnecessary expense according to the financial advisor Michael had hired to help manage her affairs. Her landline remains only because it came bundled with the basic cable she allows herself. The last time all 3 children were in the same room with her was at the closing of the house sale. They'd taken her to lunch afterward at an expensive restaurant downtown, everyone talking about how this was the right decision and a new chapter. She'd barely touched her salmon. "You'll have so much freedom now," Sarah had said, reaching across the table to pat her hand. "No maintenance, no yard work. And the trust will make sure you're comfortable." Comfortable. As if comfort could be measured in square footage and monthly allowances. The trust, she'd later discovered, came with strings. Every expenditure over $100 needed approval. Medical expenses were covered, yes, but she had to use approved providers. Her old doctor of 30 years wasn't one of them. The new one barely looks at her during their quarterly visits, typing notes into his laptop about her age-related decline. Mary moves to her small desk, where a stack of unsent letters sits in a neat pile. She writes them every week, real letters, with pen and paper, like she'd been taught in school. They detail her days, her thoughts, her memories. Sometimes they're angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes just filled with the small observations that mothers once shared with their children over Sunday dinner. She never mails them. The last time she'd tried sending a letter, Sarah had called, the only call that year, to suggest that perhaps Mom was becoming too emotional and should talk to someone. They'd added a therapist to her approved provider list. She never went. The building's radiator kicks in with a clang, making her jump slightly. Outside, the November wind whistles through the gap in her window frame, a gap she's reported 3 times to maintenance. The super always promises to fix it next week. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had offered to help her caulk it, but Mary's pride wouldn't let her accept. Pride is all she has left that's truly hers, not managed or allocated by others. She checks her watch, a Timex that James gave her on their 40th anniversary. 10:30 a.m. Time for her morning walk, weather permitting. The doctor encourages regular exercise, though she suspects he'd prefer she did it in an organized senior program rather than wandering the neighborhood alone. Bundling up in her coat, the same one she's had for 12 years, still serviceable despite its worn cuffs, Mary prepares for her daily ritual. She takes her key, singular now, not the heavy ring of house keys she once carried, and her small purse containing exactly $23 in cash, an approved amount for incidental expenses. The elevator is working today, a small mercy. As she descends, she remembers Michael's suggestion last Christmas, via email, about looking into retirement communities with more support services. She'd ignored it, just as she'd ignored Sarah's links to assisted living brochures and David's financial advisor's hints about optimizing her living situation. In the lobby, she nods to Mr. Guo, who moved in last month. He's Chinese too, though from a different province than her parents were. Sometimes they exchange greetings in Mandarin, and for a moment, she can pretend she's back in her mother's kitchen, learning to make dumplings while her mother talked about the importance of family. Family is like chopsticks, her mother used to say in Mandarin. One alone can be broken easily, but together, they are strong. Mary wonders what her mother would make of designer chopsticks that snap themselves in half. Outside, the Minneapolis morning is crisp, threatening snow. Mary turns left, her usual route taking her past the small park where young mothers gather with their children. She used to bring her own children here, when this neighborhood was different, before the old shops turned into artisanal coffee houses and vintage clothing boutiques. A young woman pushing a stroller gives her a brief smile, the kind reserved for elderly strangers, polite but distant. Mary smiles back, remembering when she was that young mother, when her world revolved around nap schedules and first steps. She passes the window of an antique store, catching her reflection. Something about her stance reminds her of her own mother in her later years, and for the first time, Mary understands the look she used to see in her mother's eyes. Not just age or tiredness, but the weight of unspoken disappointments. The irony strikes her then, sharp as the wind. She'd promised herself she'd never be like her own mother, who she'd thought too traditional, too focused on family obligation. She'd raised her children differently, encouraged their independence, celebrated their ambitions, never demanded they conform to old-world expectations. Perhaps she'd succeeded too well. A group of pigeons scatters as she approaches, and Mary thinks of the Chinese belief that one's children are like arrows. You pull them close only to let them fly away. But arrows weren't supposed to fly so far, they disappeared entirely. She reaches the small bakery that marks the halfway point of her walk. Through the window, she can see young professionals having late breakfasts, laptops open, phones in hand. The prices are ridiculous. $5 for a croissant, $7 for a sandwich. Sometimes, on special days, she allows herself to go in and buy a small coffee, pretending it's a choice rather than a constraint of her approved expenses. Not today, though. Today she has another destination. The public library stands 2 blocks away, its brick facade a familiar comfort. Inside, it's warm, and the librarians know her by name. They don't know that she comes here to use the computer, to look up her children online, to see pictures they post of vacations, of business achievements, of gatherings she's not invited to. Michael's hospital recently featured him in an article about pioneering surgery techniques. Sarah's company went public last year. The photo showed her ringing the opening bell at the stock exchange. David's real estate firm just broke ground on a new development, luxury condos where old family homes once stood. Success stories, all of them. She should be proud. She is proud. But pride doesn't keep you warm at night, doesn't call on birthdays, doesn't remember that you hate cilantro or that you always sang Moon River as a lullaby. Mary logs off the computer, nodding thanks to the librarian. Outside again, the wind has picked up, and the first snowflakes begin to fall. She pulls her coat tighter, thinking of the gap in her window, of another winter alone. The walk back seems longer, her joints protesting each step. The neighborhood blurs through her tears she allows herself only during these walks, when no one who matters can see them. Not that anyone who matters looks anymore. Back in her apartment, she hangs her coat carefully and puts the kettle on for afternoon tea. The routine helps, gives structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into formless grief. While the water heats, she retrieves a small lacquered box from her bedroom, one of the few treasures she'd insisted on keeping from the house. Inside are photographs, older ones, worn at the edges. Michael's first steps, Sarah's kindergarten graduation, David's Little League games, a family vacation to Yellowstone, all 5 of them squeezed into the frame, squinting into the sun. Happy. Together. The kettle whistles, and Mary closes the box gently, returning it to its place. She measures out 1 precise teaspoon of loose tea, a luxury she maintains despite everything, because some habits are too deeply ingrained to break. As she waits for the tea to steep, her gaze falls on the phone. In an hour it will be 3 p.m. in Boston, noon in Seattle, 2 p.m. in Chicago. Perfect times to call. The phone sits silent, accusatory in its stillness. Mary lifts her teacup with both hands, inhaling the familiar scent. Outside her window, the snow falls harder now, each flake a tiny star that dissolves on contact with the earth. Like family ties, she thinks, like promises, like love that isn't tended. She reaches for her writing pad, beginning another letter she'll never send. My dearest children, today, the first snow fell. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a letter from the trust management company. Mary's hands trembled as she opened it, the official letterhead stark against the white paper. Dear Mrs. Chen, this letter serves as notification that your discretionary spending allowance will be reduced by 30% effective immediately, due to market adjustments and concern for long-term sustainability. She read it 3 times, each word a fresh cut. The letter was signed by someone she'd never met, though it mentioned being copied to Michael and Sarah, not David. He'd removed himself from the trust management after the house sale, citing professional distance, 30%. She did the math quickly, a skill she'd never lost from her years teaching high school mathematics. Her monthly allowance would drop from $400 to $280. The letter suggested lifestyle adjustments and included a helpful pamphlet about senior budgeting. Mary set the letter down carefully, smoothing its creases with hands that had once changed diapers, bandaged scraped knees, and applauded at graduations. The silence in her apartment pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool. Her first instinct was to call Michael. He was the executor, after all. But the memory of their last conversation, him explaining why she couldn't attend Sarah's daughter's wedding, space limitations, Mom, and the venues so far, stopped her fingers inches from the dial pad. Instead, she reached for her coat. The library computers wouldn't give her all the answers, but they might give her some. She'd learned to navigate the internet slowly but thoroughly, like exploring a foreign country without a map. The November snow had settled into dirty piles along the sidewalk. Mary stepped carefully, aware that a fall at her age could mean more than just bruises. The last time she'd fallen, 2 years ago, Michael had used it as evidence in his argument for more comprehensive care options. At the library, she claimed her usual computer station. Ms. Rodriguez, the librarian who always saved it for her, offered a sympathetic smile. "Everything okay, Mrs. Chen? You're usually not here until tomorrow." "Just checking some numbers," Mary replied, her voice steady despite everything. The Trust's website was sleek, professional, designed to inspire confidence. Mary logged in with the password Sarah had set up for her grandson's birth date, though she'd never met him in person. The account overview confirmed the letter's contents, with additional details about market volatility and prudent adjustments. But it was the activity log that made her breath catch. Regular payments to a financial advisor she'd never approved. Quarterly management fees that seemed to grow each time. And there, buried in the transactions, a wire transfer to David's development company, listed as an investment opportunity. They were using her money, what was left of it after the house sale, to fund their own ventures. Legal, probably. The trust documents she'd signed gave them broad powers, but the realization sat in her stomach like spoiled food. The screen blurred, and Mary realized she was crying. She closed the browser quickly, not wanting Ms. Rodriguez to notice. Outside, the early winter darkness was settling in, streetlights flickering to life. That evening, her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on her door. "Mary, I made too much soup again. Would you help me out by taking some?" It was a fiction they both maintained, these accidental cooking surpluses. Mrs. Patterson, a widow herself, understood what it meant to eat alone. The soup was always exactly 2 portions, enough for dinner and lunch tomorrow. "Sarah called," Mary said as they sat at her small table. "About the trust adjustment." Mrs. Patterson's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "And?" "She didn't. I was just practicing saying it. Like rehearsing for a play that never opens." The soup was good. Homemade chicken noodle, with thick egg noodles that reminded Mary of the ones she used to make from scratch when the children were young. Michael would always sneak raw dough when he thought she wasn't looking. "You know," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "my daughter Rebecca works for legal aid. They have people who specialize in elder rights." Mary shook her head. "They're my children. That's why it matters more, not less." Later, alone again, Mary pulled out her phone bill. She'd been keeping the landline because it was her children's most reliable way to reach her. But they didn't call, did they? The last 6 months of itemized calls showed only telemarketers, her doctor's office, and Mrs. Patterson. The next morning, she walked to the phone company's office and canceled her landline. The customer service representative seemed surprised. Most of their elderly customers clung to landlines like lifelines. "Are you sure, Mom? What if there's an emergency?" Mary thought of all the emergencies that had already happened. The fall, the window that wouldn't seal, the trust reduction, the wedding she wasn't invited to, the grandson she'd never held. "I have a neighbor," she said. "She checks on me." The money saved, $45 monthly, would help offset the trust reduction. Mary felt a fierce pride in this small act of independence, even as part of her wondered if her children would notice when they tried to call on Christmas. If they tried to call on Christmas. That afternoon, she did something she'd been considering for months. She walked to the senior center 6 blocks away, the one she'd been avoiding because it felt too much like giving in to her children's image of her as just another old person waiting to die. The place surprised her. Art classes, book clubs, computer lessons, and people, so many people, with stories like hers. Children too busy, too distant, too absorbed in their own lives. But here, they'd built something new. Not a replacement for family, but a community of understanding. Carol, a retired nurse with silver hair and laugh lines, was teaching basic smartphone skills. "You can get one of the simple models," she explained, "and prepaid plans are cheaper than contracts." Mary thought of her carefully rationed allowance. "I don't know." "Think of it this way," Carol said. "You can have your own photos, your own music, your own way to reach out, or not reach out. It's independence." independence. The word echoed in Mary's mind as she walked home. The trust controlled her money, her housing, her medical care. But they couldn't control everything, not if she didn't let them. She spent that evening making lists, real ones, not the kind the trust's pamphlet suggested. Assets she still controlled, skills she still had, options she'd never considered. The next day brought another surprise, a certified letter from the trust company requesting her presence at a family meeting in December. All 3 children would be there. The letter mentioned concerns about long-term care planning and sustainable management strategies. Mary recognized the corporate euphemisms. They were planning something bigger than a simple allowance reduction. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's daughter at Legal Aid, of Carol at the senior center teaching digital independence, of Mr. Guo in the lobby who'd mentioned his son was a paralegal. She called Mrs. Patterson that evening. "Rebecca can see you Thursday," her neighbor said. "No charge for the initial consultation. And Mary, you're doing the right thing." The next week passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Mary gathered documents, made copies at the library, learned terms like power of attorney and fiduciary duty. She downloaded her bank statements going back 5 years, using the computer skills Carol had taught her. The trust reduction notice had awakened something in her, not just anger, but clarity. She saw now how each small surrender had led to this point. The house sale, the trust establishment, the approved providers. Each step presented as care, as protection, as children looking out for their elderly mother. But protection shouldn't feel like prison, and care shouldn't come with so many strings attached. Rebecca, Mrs. Patterson's daughter, reviewed her documents in a small office decorated with family photos. "The good news," she said, "is that there are irregularities in how the trust has been managed. The bad news is that challenging it means challenging your children directly. Are you prepared for that?" Mary looked at the family photo on Rebecca's desk. 3 generations smiling together at what looked like a backyard barbecue. The kind of gathering her own family hadn't had in years. "They challenged me first," she said quietly. "They just didn't tell me it was a challenge." That night, she dreamed of the old house. Not as it was at the end, but as it had been when the children were young. The kitchen where she'd taught them to make dumplings, the backyard where James had built the treehouse, the living room where they'd opened Christmas presents together. She woke to snow falling outside her window, the gap in the frame whistling softly. But instead of her usual morning ritual, she sat down at her desk and began to write. Not a letter this time, but a statement. Clear, direct, unsparing. "To my children, I have been silent too long." The words flowed easily now, years of unsent letters distilling into something stronger. She wrote about the trust's mismanagement, about David's company receiving investments without her knowledge, about Michael's medical decisions made without consultation, about Sarah's digital surveillance of her accounts. She wrote about love too, fierce, unending maternal love that made the betrayal sharper, not softer. Love that demanded truth rather than comfortable lies. When she finished, she made 3 copies, one for her records, one for Rebecca, and one for the family meeting in December. Let them come with their plans and their proposals. She had plans of her own now. That afternoon, she bought her first smartphone, a simple model with a prepaid plan, just as Carol had suggested. She learned to take photos, to send texts, to download apps. Small steps toward digital independence. She took a selfie, her first ever, and sent it to her new email address. In the photo, she was smiling, but it wasn't the careful smile of her mantelpiece photos. This was something different, something stronger. The trust reduction had been meant to remind her of her dependence. Instead, it had awakened her to the possibility of independence. Not the kind her children had pursued, chasing success across the country, but something more fundamental. The independence of saying, enough. December approached with its threat of family confrontation, but Mary felt strangely calm. She had allies now, Mrs. Patterson, Rebecca, Carol, the community she'd found at the senior center. Not replacements for family, but witnesses. People who saw her as she was, not as someone to be managed. The gap in her window still whistled, but she'd learned to hear it differently. Not as a symbol of neglect, but as a reminder that even broken things could let in light and air. That gaps could be passages, not just problems. She added one final sentence to her statement. I am not asking for permission to live my life. I am taking back the power to live it. The family meeting was scheduled for December 15th at the trust company's downtown Minneapolis office. Mary arrived 20 minutes early, her new smartphone in her purse, Rebecca's business card tucked beside it. The conference room windows offered a view of the city she'd lived in for 60 years, now wrapped in winter gray. Michael arrived first, his surgeon's precision evident in his pressed suit and perfectly knotted tie. He moved to hug her, then hesitated when she remained seated. Sarah came next, already typing on her phone. David was last, his real estate developer's confidence filling the room. Mom, Michael began, we're concerned. I know about the investments in David's company, Mary interrupted, her voice steady. I know about the unauthorized management fees. I know about everything. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah's fingers froze over her phone. David's confident smile flickered. Those were approved investments, Michael said carefully. The trust documents require my notification and consent. Mary removed her prepared statement from her purse. I have copies for everyone. She watched their faces as they read. Michael's professional mask cracking slightly. Sarah's tech executive composure slipping. David's developer's confidence faltering. Mom, Sarah tried, everything we've done has been to protect you. Protect me? Mary's laugh was sharp. You sold my house without real consultation. You chose my doctors without asking. You cut my allowance without warning. Tell me, what were you protecting, me or my money? David leaned forward. The market conditions made it convenient to invest my money in your development project. Mary's new smartphone recorded the meeting quietly in her purse, just as Rebecca had suggested. A project you knew about when you pushed for the house sale? The trust manager, a Mr. Collins, cleared his throat. Mrs. Chen, perhaps we should focus on the future. Your children have prepared a comprehensive care plan. No. The word fell like a stone into still water. I have prepared my own plan. She pushed copies of a second document across the table. Rebecca had helped her prepare it, a formal challenge to the trust management, with documentation of every questionable transaction. You can't do this, Michael said, his doctor's authority strained. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Mary's voice remained calm. Did you know I bought a smartphone? Sarah, you should appreciate that. You always said I needed to modernize. I've learned to use it quite well. I even recorded this meeting. Sarah's face paled. Mom, that's not legal. Minnesota is a one-party consent state, Mary replied. I looked it up at the senior center's legal workshop. I've learned quite a lot there. About rights, about options, about how children sometimes use trusts to control their parents' lives. The silence that followed was different from the first, heavier, charged with realization. Their mother wasn't just pushing back. She was pushing back with knowledge, with evidence, with support. What do you want? David asked finally. I want control of my life back. I want the trust dissolved. I want my assets returned to my management. That's not possible, Michael began, but Mary held up her hand. It is possible. It's also legal. And if you fight me on this, everything, the unauthorized investments, the management fees, the secret deals, becomes public record. How would that affect your medical practice, Michael? Your IPO plans, Sarah? Your development company, David? She watched the threats land, saw them calculate costs and benefits like the business people they'd become. When had they stopped being her children and become shareholders in her life? Give me until the end of the week, Michael said finally. We'll need to consult with lawyers. You have until tomorrow noon, Mary replied. My lawyer will contact yours with the paperwork. Your lawyer? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Rebecca Patterson. You might know her firm. They specialize in elder rights cases. They're quite famous for winning." The meeting ended shortly after, her children filing out with stunned expressions. Only David lingered. "The development project," he said quietly. "It wasn't just about money. I thought if it succeeded, you'd be proud." Mary felt the old maternal instinct to comfort him, to say of course she was proud. But that wasn't the whole truth anymore. "I was already proud of you," she said instead. "I just wanted to be your mother, not your investment opportunity." That evening, Mrs. Patterson brought soup again. They sat at Mary's small table, steam rising from their bowls. "Rebecca called," Mrs. Patterson said. "She said you were magnificent." Mary stirred her soup thoughtfully. "I kept thinking about what you said, that them being my children made it matter more, not less. You were right." The next day, the lawyers began their work. Michael's team proposed compromises, partial dissolution, graduated return of control. Sarah's specialists suggested oversight periods and evaluation metrics. David recused himself entirely. Mary refused them all. By Christmas Eve, it was done. The trust dissolved, her assets returned to her control. The victory felt hollow and profound at once, like winning a war but losing the peace. She spent Christmas Day at the senior center with Carol and others who understood. They shared stories, meals, and a strange kind of hope, not for reconciliation perhaps, but for resurrection of self. New Year approached with fresh snow and possibilities. Mary began looking for a new apartment, something she chose for herself. She joined the Senior Center's advisory board, bringing her teaching experience to their education programs. The photos on her mantelpiece stayed, but she added new ones, herself with Carol and the smartphone class, with Mrs. Patterson at the holiday dinner, with Rebecca at the celebration of the trust dissolution. Different kinds of family pictures. Her children's silence stretched into January. She didn't expect immediate reconciliation. Some bridges, once burned, needed time to be rebuilt, if they could be rebuilt at all. But on a cold morning in late January, her new smartphone chimed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, can we talk? Just talk?" Mary stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of possibility in those simple words. Finally, she typed back, "Yes, but this time, we talk as equals." February brought thaw and change. Mary moved into a new apartment, second floor, south-facing, with windows that sealed properly. She'd chosen it herself, signing the lease with her own name, paying with her own money. The place cost more than her previous apartment, but she could afford it now. Financial independence had revealed what she'd suspected. The trust's management had been more about control than conservation. Sarah's text had led to coffee at a small cafe near Mary's new home. They sat across from each other like strangers learning to be friends. "The development project failed," Sarah said quietly. "David's company filed for bankruptcy last week." Mary sipped her green tea. "I know. I still read the business news." "He won't admit it, but losing your investment, the trust's investment, was the final blow." Sarah traced the rim of her untouched coffee cup. He wanted so badly to prove himself. To whom? The question hung between them. Sarah looked up, really looked at her mother for the first time in years. "To you, I think. To Dad. To all of us." Mary thought of David at 7, proudly showing off his Lego buildings. At 12, sketching house designs in his school notebooks. At 18, declaring he'd build the tallest towers in Minneapolis. "He never needed to prove anything," she said finally. "None of you did." Sarah's tears came then, quiet but steady. "We thought we were protecting you. After Dad died, you seemed so lost. We wanted to make everything secure, safe. By taking away my choices. By making the hard decisions for you." Sarah wiped her eyes. "We were wrong. I see that now." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Michael proved harder. The dissolution of the trust had wounded his pride as much as his pocketbook. But in March, when Mary joined the Senior Center's medical advocacy program, he sent a text. "Mom, heard you're helping seniors navigate healthcare choices. Could use your insight on some patient communication issues at the hospital." They met in his office, surrounded by medical degrees and awards. He looked older than she remembered, tired in a way surgery couldn't explain. "The trust," he started, then stopped. Tried again. "I was so focused on managing your health, your future, that I forgot to ask what you wanted that future to be." Mary thought of all the doctor's appointments where he'd spoken for her, about her, but never to her. "I'm still your mother, Michael, not your patient." "I know. After Dad, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too. Control was easier than care." Spring came early that year. Mary's new apartment filled with light and gradually with visitors. Sarah brought her children, Mary's grandchildren, for Sunday dinners. Michael consulted her about his hospital's new senior care protocols. Even David, humbled by failure, came to sit in her kitchen and talk about starting over. The photos on her mantelpiece shifted, new memories joining the old. Christmas at the Senior Center, Sarah's daughter's piano recital, Michael's hospital volunteer award ceremony, David breaking ground on a smaller, community-focused project. But other photos remained too. Carol teaching smartphone skills, Mrs. Patterson at community events, Rebecca receiving an Elder Rights Advocacy Award. Family wasn't just blood anymore. It was choice, connection, community. One warm evening in May, Mary hosted a dinner party. Her small dining table couldn't hold everyone, so they spread into the living room, balancing plates on laps. Her children, their children, her senior center friends, neighbors, all together. The conversation flowed like wine, stories weaving past and present. Sarah's daughter asked about Mary's teaching days. Michael shared hospital humor with Carol. David and Mr. Guo discussed community development in rapid Mandarin. Looking around, Mary saw what she'd almost lost. Not just her independence, but her ability to create connection on her own terms. The trust had tried to shrink her world to manageable size. Instead, she'd expanded it beyond blood and obligation. Later, after guests left and dishes were done, Mary stood at her window. The city lights sparkled below, each one a story, a life, a possibility. Her phone chimed with messages, photos from the evening, thanks from guests, plans for next time. She thought of that first letter from the trust company, how it had awakened her from years of quiet surrender. Sometimes loss led to finding, sometimes bridges had to burn for new ones to be built. On her desk, the pile of unsent letters remained, but she hadn't added to it in months. She had better ways to communicate now, not just technology, but truth. Hard truths, healing truths, truths that hurt and helped, and finally set her free. Her children were learning too. Sarah had started a tech program for seniors. Michael volunteered at the Senior Center's health clinic. David's new project included affordable senior housing. They weren't perfect. The past couldn't be undone. Trust, like bridges, had to be rebuilt slowly, intentionally, with care for the foundations. But they were trying, and so was she. Mary picked up her phone and opened the family group chat. A new tradition, started after the trust dissolution. She typed carefully, still getting used to the small keyboard. "Thank you for tonight, for being here, for learning with me, for understanding that love doesn't mean control, and independence doesn't mean alone." The responses came quickly. "Love you, Mom. Sarah. Same time next week? Michael, save me some leftovers. David." Mary smiled, added a heart emoji, Carol would be proud, and set her phone aside. Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, her apartment held memories old and new, chosen family and born family, past hurts and future hopes. She was 87, and she was finally, truly, living on her own terms. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges, more choices. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. Not left behind, but moving forward.